The weight of a man's gaze was a physical thing. Anika felt it from across the ballroom, a heavy, proprietary pressure settling on the bare skin of her shoulders. Mr. Sterling. His smile was a thin, wet line in a doughy face, a promise of a life so suffocatingly beige it made her soul ache. The sleeveless dark purple dress her mother had insisted upon suddenly felt less like a statement of elegance and more like the wrapping on a very expensive, unwanted gift. Around her, champagne flutes chimed like tiny, frantic bells, and the murmur of Tokyo's elite was a low, constant hum. It was all a performance, and she was the unwilling lead. Her parents had called this trip a business opportunity, a cultural exchange. It was a lie. It was a transaction. They were offering her up to seal a deal with Sterling's conglomerate, and the politeness of it all was the most violent part. He would be a good husband, they said. Stable. Powerful. He looked at her like he was calculating her value, and it made her want to shatter the crystal in her hand. She needed an escape. Not just from the conversation, but from the entire trajectory of her life as it was being laid out before her on a silver platter. Her eyes scanned the room, a desperate search for a shield, a disruption, anything to break the inexorable pull of Sterling's orbit. And then she saw him. He was not a man so much as a void in the glittering tapestry of the gala. While others mingled and laughed, he stood alone near a floor-to-ceiling window, the neon-drenched cityscape of Shinjuku, a chaotic mural behind him. He was a study in stillness. The cut of his black suit was surgical, sharp enough to draw blood. He held a glass of what looked like whiskey, but his hand was so steady it seemed carved from the same obsidian as his eyes. People didn't just avoid him. They curved around him, their chatter dipping as they passed, a tide receding from a dangerous shore. The most telling detail was the ink, the intricate blue-black patterns of a dragon's tail that curled just above the starched white collar of his shirt, a dark secret whispering at the edge of his restraint. Kaito Tanaka. She knew the name. It was spoken in hushed tones by the other executives her father dealt with. The unseen power, the silent partner in countless ventures, the head of the Tanaka-gumi. The kind of man good girls from good families were warned about. The kind of man who ate men like Sterling for breakfast. He was perfect. Sterling was closing in, his polished shoes squeaking on the marble. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Anika's chest. It was a terrible idea. A reckless, insane, career-ending, possibly life-ending idea. She took a deep breath, the scent of orchids and expensive perfume filling her lungs, and walked. She moved with a purpose she did not feel, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the floor. The sea of people parted for her as she approached the still point of the room. Kaito Tanaka didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on some point outside the window, lost in the city's electric glow. He had to have noticed her approach. A man like that noticed everything. He simply didn't acknowledge her. It was the most profound dismissal she had ever experienced. She was 2 feet away when Sterling's voice, unctuous and cloying, reached her. "Anika, my dear. I was just coming to find you. This was it. No turning back." She closed the distance, her movements fluid, and did the unthinkable. She slipped her arm through Kaito Tanaka's, her fingers brushing the fine wool of his suit. It was like touching a statue, all cool, hard planes of muscle beneath the fabric. He finally moved, his head turning just enough to look down at her. His eyes were not black, she realized. They were a brown so dark they swallowed the light, ancient and unreadable. For a heartbeat, she thought he would throw her off, call security, have her removed from the building and possibly the mortal coil. She forced a brilliant, false smile. "Darling, there you are," she said, her voice a little too high. "I was just telling Mr. Sterling how we had to leave soon." She met Sterling's stunned gaze over Kaito's arm. The man's jaw had gone slack, his face paling. The silence that fell around them was absolute, a bubble of cold shock in the warm, buzzing room. The world held its breath. Kaito Tanaka looked from her face to Sterling's. He didn't pull his arm away. He didn't push her aside. The faintest scent of cedar and smoke drifted from him, clean and dangerous. Then he spoke. His voice was not the gravelly rasp she might have expected. It was a low, quiet rumble, a vibration she felt more than heard through his arm. It held the lethal calm of a storm's eye. "Is there a problem?" Mr. Sterling flinched as if struck. He shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion.
No.
No, of course not. A misunderstanding. My apologies, Tanaka-sama. He practically bowed, stumbling backward before turning and melting into the crowd like a snowman in a furnace. Anika's heart was hammering against her ribs, so hard she was sure Kaido could feel it. She had done it. She had grabbed a tiger by the tail, and now she was left with the terrifying reality of its teeth. His grip, which hadn't been there a moment before, was suddenly on her elbow. It wasn't painful, but it was unmistakable. An anchor, a manacle. "Walk with me," he commanded, his voice a soft murmur meant only for her.
It was not a request.
He led her not back into the party, but through a discreet door she hadn't noticed, into a silent, carpeted hallway. The noise of the gala vanished, cut off as if by a knife. They walked past closed doors until he stopped at one, pressing his thumb to a scanner beside the handle. It clicked open, revealing a private lounge, stark and minimalist. A single leather couch, a low table, and another panoramic window showcasing the glittering, indifferent city. The door hissed shut behind them, sealing them in a tomb of silence. He released her arm and turned to face her, his posture relaxed but radiating a coiled energy that made the air in the room feel thin. He gestured to the couch. She remained standing. "You have 5 minutes to explain," he said, his voice stripped of the performative calm from the ballroom. It was now flat, cold steel. "Why me?" Anika swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "He wouldn't let me go. My parents, they're trying to arrange a marriage." "A common problem," Kaido said, unimpressed. "It doesn't explain why you chose to solve it by publicly claiming the head of the Tanakagumi as your husband." "Because you were the only person in that room he was afraid of," she answered, the truth raw and unvarnished. "You were the most dangerous option, the only one that would work." He watched her, his head tilted slightly. He was processing her words, her tone, the desperate gamble she had taken. She expected anger, a cold dismissal, a threat. What she saw instead was a flicker of something in those dark eyes, a shadow of an old memory she couldn't possibly understand. "A cage is a cage," he said, the words so quiet she almost missed them. Whether it is made of gold or steel, he seemed to be speaking more to himself than to her. It was a crack in the marble facade, a glimpse of a wound he kept hidden from the world. A wound, she suspected, that had been carved by a woman. Someone he had failed to free from her own cage. Before she could process the strange intimacy of the moment, a sharp rap sounded at the door. Kaido's expression became impassive once more. "Enter." A man in a dark suit, his face a mask of disciplined deference, stepped inside and bowed low.
"Sir."
The Hashimoto clan was present tonight. Their men are already asking questions.
"About you."
"And the woman with you." Kaido's eyes met Anika's across the room. The air crackled. Her desperate, impulsive lie had not just solved a personal problem, it had thrown a stone into a very deep, very dark pond, and the ripples were already becoming waves. She had made herself a target in a war she didn't understand. "They see you as a new variable," Kaido stated, his gaze pinning her in place. "A weakness." He was giving her a choice. She could see it in the hard line of his jaw. This was the precipice. "I can have you on a private plane in an hour," he offered, his tone clinical, devoid of emotion. "A new name, a new life. You will disappear from your world, and from mine. Or," he paused, the silence stretching, "you stay and you play this part. You become my wife in the eyes of our enemies. The second option is not safe." Her old life was a gilded prison cell with Mr. Sterling as the warden. This new life was a minefield with a silent, lethal stranger as her only guide. Running meant defeat, a return to the suffocating expectations of her family. Staying was a leap into an abyss, but at least it was a leap she was choosing to make. It was terrifying. It was also the first time in a long time she had felt truly alive. She lifted her chin, meeting his unblinking stare. "I'll stay." A long moment passed. He didn't smile, but she saw something shift in his eyes, a glimmer of respect, perhaps, or maybe just pure, cold calculation. He stepped toward her, closing the space between them until he was standing directly in front of her. He was taller than she'd realized, his presence commanding the very air she breathed. He reached out, his movements deliberate. She flinched, but he didn't touch her skin. Instead, his long fingers gently hooked the thin strap of her purple dress, which had slipped slightly from her shoulder. He slowly, carefully slid it back into place. His knuckles brushed the sensitive curve of her collarbone. The touch was featherlight, almost accidental, but it sent a shockwave through her entire system, a jolt of heat that had nothing to do with fear. Their eyes locked. The room was silent save for the frantic beat of her own heart. He was assessing her, seeing past the desperate girl in the ballroom to the woman who had just gambled her life and chosen to double down. For the first time, she saw something other than cold authority in his gaze. It was a flicker of intense, unnerving curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he had not expected to find, and was now compelled to solve. The game had begun, and she had just discovered the rules were far more complicated and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. He took her to a penthouse that scraped the sky. It was a fortress of glass and black steel, overlooking the sprawling, electric nebula of Tokyo. The furnishings were sparse, expensive, and utterly devoid of personal touch. It was less a home and more a monument to control. A beautiful, sterile prison. "There are rules," Kaito said, standing by the vast window, his back to her. He hadn't looked at her since they'd entered the silent elevator that brought them here. "You will be seen with me at all times when we are in public.
You will defer to me.
You will not speak to my business associates unless spoken to. You will learn the faces of my enemies and my allies. My head of security, Ishida, will brief you." It was a litany of commands, delivered in that same flat, dispassionate tone. He was drawing the lines of her new cage. "And in private?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned then, and the full force of his attention felt like a physical blow. "In private, you'll do exactly as I say to ensure your survival. Because your survival is now tied to my reputation. Your lie made you my liability. Your continued existence makes you my asset. Do you understand?" "I understand that my life is no longer my own," she said, the words tasting like ash. "It was never yours to begin with," he replied, a statement of fact, not cruelty. "You simply traded one master for another." The days that followed were a blur of structured tension. She was fitted for clothes by silent tailors, driven in black cars with tinted windows, and sat through meetings where men with hard eyes spoke in coded language. She was a ghost in his machine, a beautiful prop to legitimize a lie. Ishida, a stern man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, showed her photographs, naming the heads of the Hashimoto clan, their lieutenants, and their known enforcers. He taught her about their rivalries, their territories, their methods. It was a crash course in a world she never knew existed beneath the polished surface of the city. Through it all, Kaito was a constant, silent presence. He was there, but he was remote. They shared meals in silence, the clink of silverware the only sound. At night, she slept in a guest suite that was as luxurious and soulless as the rest of the penthouse, the door always left slightly ajar, a silent reminder that she was under constant surveillance. She found herself watching him. She noticed the way his fingers, long and elegant, would trace the rim of his teacup as he listened to his men report. She saw the subtle shift in his posture when a name he disliked was mentioned. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost predatory, never a wasted gesture, never a flicker of indecision. He was the most disciplined, controlled human being she had ever met. One evening, she was standing by the window in the main living area, tracing the path of the headlights on the expressway far below. The city was a river of light, beautiful and distant. She felt a presence behind her and knew it was him. She didn't turn. "You're thinking of your old life," he stated. I'm thinking I don't know what's worse, she admitted softly. A predictable prison or a beautiful one. She felt him move closer. The illusion of choice is the most effective cage of all. Before she could ask what he meant, the world exploded in a shower of glass. A sharp crack echoed through the room, and the window she'd been looking through shattered, a spiderweb of cracks appearing with a hole at its center. Kaido moved with a speed that defied physics. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, yanking her backward as he threw them both to the floor. His body covered hers, a solid, heavy shield against a threat she hadn't even seen. Shards of safety glass rained down on them, tinkling like broken ice on the cold marble. His weight was crushing, the hard lines of his body pressed against hers. She could feel the frantic beat of her own heart, the smell of ozone and his cologne, that same cedar and smoke, filling her senses. He was breathing hard, his breath warm against her ear. They lay there for a long moment in the sudden, ringing silence, the city lights flickering through the broken pane of glass. The danger was no longer an abstract concept from Ishida's files. It was real. It was here. And he had just saved her life. His men swarmed the room, weapons drawn, speaking in low, urgent tones. Kaido pushed himself up, pulling her with him. His hands were on her shoulders, his dark eyes scanning her for injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She shook her head, unable to speak. The assassination attempt had failed, but it had succeeded in one thing. It had shattered the sterile distance between them. There was no more pretense. They were in this together, bound by the lies she had told and the blood his enemies wanted to spill. They caught one of the men. Not the sniper, but a spotter from a nearby building. A low-level soldier from the Hashimoto clan. Ishida's men brought him to a warehouse down by the docks, a place that smelled of rust and seawater. Anika insisted on going. Kaido had forbidden it, but she pushed back. "If I'm your wife, I need to see this. I need to understand." To her surprise, he'd relented with a single, sharp nod. The man was tied to a chair, his face bruised and swollen with fear. Kaido stood before him, exuding a chilling calm that was far more terrifying than any overt threat. His men flanked him, silent and waiting. Anika stood in the shadows, her arms wrapped around herself, her stomach churning. She knew what was coming. An interrogation. Violence. Kaido was about to speak when Anika noticed something. Her mind, trained to observe the minute details of art and antiquity, saw what the hardened soldiers had missed. On the captive's wrist, peeking from under his sleeve, was a tattoo. It wasn't the Hashimoto crest. It was a smaller, more intricate design, a stylized knot. And on a thin chain around his neck was a small silver pendant, the same knot. She had seen it before. On one of Kaido's own lieutenants, a man named Ryota, who always seemed to watch Kaido with a veiled resentment. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Every head turned to her. Kaido's eyes narrowed. She stepped forward, her fear warring with a strange, cold certainty. "He's not Hashimoto," she said, her voice clear. "Look at his tattoo. The pendant. It's Ryota's mark. I've seen it on him and two of his personal guards." A heavy silence descended on the warehouse. Ishida stepped forward, roughly pushing up the man's sleeve, then yanking the pendant from his neck. He examined them, then looked at Kaido, his face grim. "She's right. The betrayal was from within." Ryota had used a Hashimoto patsy to order the hit, hoping to incite a war and seize power in the chaos. Anika hadn't just saved Kaido from a sniper, she had just exposed a traitor in his inner circle. She had looked into the abyss of his world and hadn't flinched. She had participated. She had pointed a finger and, in doing so, had likely signed that man's death warrant. A line had been crossed, and she knew, with a sickening lurch, that she could never go back. Later that night, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. The broken window in the penthouse had been replaced, leaving no trace of the violence. But something was irrevocably fractured between them. The distance was gone, replaced by a new, more dangerous intimacy. She found him in his study, a a stark room lined with books she was certain he'd never read. He was staring at a single, framed photograph on his desk. She was too far away to see the image clearly, but she could guess. The woman he'd failed to protect. The reason for the cage of control he'd built around his life. He didn't look up as she entered. "You see things others miss," he said, his voice quiet. "That is a dangerous quality." "I told myself staying here was just about escaping one prison for another," she confessed, walking closer. "I'm not sure that's true anymore." He finally looked up, his eyes dark and intense. "And what is it now?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. She couldn't answer it. Survival? Power? Or something else, something she was terrified to name. He said her name then. Anika. He said it differently than anyone else ever had. Not as a label, but as a discovery. It was a sound that was both a warning and a promise, a claim staked in the silent battlefield of the room. The traitor, Ryota, now knew he was exposed. And he knew who had exposed him. Anika was no longer just a liability or an asset. She was a threat. Kaido's new eyes. And threats had to be eliminated. The enemy was no longer outside the walls. He was within the fortress, and his target was no longer Kaido. It was her. The next attack was not loud. It was silent and swift. Kaido was in a meeting in another part of the city, a meeting Ryota had orchestrated to draw him away. Anika was in the penthouse's private gallery, a white, sterile room filled with priceless ceramics and scrolls. She had found a strange solace there, a connection to her old life. She was examining a 17th-century porcelain vase when she felt the change in the air. A subtle drop in temperature, the faintest sound of a door gliding open. Two of Ryota's men stood there. They didn't have guns drawn. They didn't need them. Their confidence was its own weapon. They thought she was a curator, a soft civilian, an easy prize to be taken and used as leverage against their boss. Her heart leaped into her throat, but panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Kaido's world had taught her that. She subtly pressed the silent alarm on the small device Ishida had insisted she carry at all times. But she knew it would take minutes for help to arrive. Minutes she didn't have. "Ryota sends his regards," the first man said, stepping forward. She had to think. She couldn't outfight them, but maybe she could outthink them. Her eyes darted around the room, cataloging her surroundings not as art, but as tools. A heavy bronze sculpture on a tall, unstable pedestal. A low-slung display case with a sharp corner. A priceless collection of pottery. "He's making a mistake," she said, her voice level, buying time. The men laughed. The only mistake was Tanaka bringing a woman into his business. As the second man moved to grab her, Anika acted. She didn't run for the door. She ran deeper into the gallery, directly toward a display of delicate celadone pottery. With a sweep of her arm, she shoved the entire collection to the floor. The sound of priceless history shattering on the marble was deafening, a gunshot of porcelain. It was a signal, a specific one she and Ishida had arranged for a worst-case scenario. Destruction of high-value assets. A breach of the inner sanctum. The crash startled the men, giving her a precious second. She ducked behind the heavy sculpture as the first man lunged. Using all her strength, she shoved the base of the pedestal. It rocked, teetered for a heart-stopping moment, and then crashed down, not on the man, but in the space between them, blocking his path with 1,000 pounds of metal and stone. She hadn't waited to be rescued. She had built her own barricade. The second man was on her then, his hand grabbing her arm. But the cavalry had arrived. The gallery doors burst open and Kaido's men, led by Ishida, flooded the room. The fight was a blur of brutal, efficient motion. It was over in less than a minute. But Ryota was there. He had slipped in behind his men, a hidden blade in his hand, his eyes fixed on Kaido, who had just entered the room, his focus on the immediate threat. Ryota saw his opening, a direct path to Kaido's unprotected back. Anika saw it too. There was no time to shout a warning. Her eyes landed on a heavy bronze paperweight on a nearby desk, shaped like a coiled dragon. Without thinking, she grabbed it. It was heavy, solid in her palm. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, she threw it with all her might. The bronze dragon flew across the room, striking Ryota's wrist with a sickening crack. The blade clattered to the floor. Ryota howled in pain, clutching his broken arm, his face a mask of disbelief. She had saved him. The traitors were subdued, dragged from the room. Silence fell, thick with the smell of sweat and the dust of shattered artifacts. Kaido walked past his men, his eyes never leaving Anika. He stopped in front of her, his gaze taking in her defiant stance amidst the wreckage. He reached out, his hands surprisingly gentle, and checked her for injuries, his fingers brushing her arms, her face. He looked at the chaos she had caused, the broken pottery, the toppled sculpture. He looked at the discarded blade near his feet. Then he looked back at her, and for the first time, the mask of the Yakuza boss was completely gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded. "They underestimated you," he said, his voice low and rough. "Everyone does," she replied, her own voice shaking but steady. He reached up, his thumb brushing a smudge of dust from her cheek. His touch lingered. "Not anymore." It wasn't a confession of love. It was something more profound, an acknowledgement, a statement of absolute fact. In his world, respect was the highest currency, and she had just earned it in blood and broken porcelain. The cost was her old life, her innocence, any chance of returning to the woman she had been. She had walked into his world to escape a cage, only to find herself at the center of a war. But standing here, in the ruins she had made, with his unblinking gaze on her, it felt less like a prison and more like a throne. The penthouse, once cold and sterile, now felt like a fortress they defended together. The broken art was not a loss. It was a testament to her survival, a symbol of the life she had been willing to shatter to forge a new one. He didn't speak of the future. He didn't make promises. He simply held out his hand. Anika looked at it. The long, elegant fingers. The faint traces of ink at the wrist. The hand of a killer, a king, a man who commanded an empire of shadows. She thought of Mr. Sterling's soft, clammy grip, the life of polite suffocation it represented. She looked from Kaido's hand up to his face, into his dark, steady eyes. They held no apologies for what he was, only an invitation to stand beside him. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive warmth. Her choice was made, not in a desperate moment at a gala, but here, in the quiet aftermath of violence. The neon lights of Tokyo glittered below them, a kingdom of glass and steel she had just inherited. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a language they both understood perfectly.